Before I get on to the subject matter of this video, I'm just going to say a few things about the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, which is now being commemorated, if that is the right word, at least it's been discussed, in certain British newspapers, though not, it must be said, in all of them, and which is being, I noticed, debated far less in the United States, where, of course, the key decisions were made. Anyway, what I want to say about the Iraq War is this. There's been an awful lot of discussion about the reasoning behind the Iraq War and what role the claims about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction had in that war, and what was the effect of 9/11 in causing that war. My own view is that none of this is in any way actually relevant to the decision to go to war, to launch that invasion of Iraq in 2003. Iraq must be understood instead as part of a sequence of what I'm going to call neocon wars, wars of choice, wars which were launched by a powerful group of people in Washington, starting, in my opinion, with the Panama intervention, which took place during the era of George H.W. Bush, going through the war in Yugoslavia in 1999, which, note, took place before 9/11, the point which many people claim is, in fact, the trigger point for these neocon wars. We then had the invasion of Afghanistan, which, by the way, I opposed, just as I opposed the Yugoslav war, the war against Iraq, which I also opposed, and then, of course, we had the war in Libya and the various attempts to destabilize and overthrow the government of Syria, which failed to end in a war with US and Western forces directly launched to overthrow the government of Syria, only because by this point the international climate had changed to the point that it was no longer possible for the Western powers to do this in the way that they had done previously, and because, in part, Western public opinion had by that point become thoroughly disenchanted with all of these wars. It need hardly be said that every one of these wars, which was a war of choice, was disastrous in its consequences. They caused, all of them, massive devastation to the countries that they were directed against, and they severely weakened the international system and the whole system of international law, and, by the way, the practice of law in the countries, Britain and the United States primarily, which launched them. It's also the case, however, that there's never been a proper accounting for any of these wars. There's never been a recognition that these wars had the disastrous effects that I've said. And above all, there's been no recognition or acceptance or acknowledgement that every one of these wars, including first and foremost the war in Iraq, but also the one in Afghanistan, that all of these wars have, in the end, weakened the geopolitical power of the West. I say that because I have no doubt that all of these wars, taken together, were launched to pursue geopolitical objectives. They were intended to lock in permanently a situation where the United States and the Western powers had a preeminent position in world affairs. Well, in the Middle East, where most of these wars were fought, US dominance is not so much being challenged now as in the process of a rapid motion collapse, with even countries like Saudi Arabia formerly the anchor of the US system, now drifting away from the United States and seeking other allies and other friends. Now, this now brings me to the war in Ukraine, because though this war has complex origins, there have been domestic aspects to it within Ukraine, there have been issues of Russian policy as well. I have absolutely no doubt that the fundamental reason, the ultimate cause, if you will, of the war in Ukraine, of the reason why there is a war in Ukraine, is because the same group of people who led the West into all of those other wars pursued policies in Ukraine and towards Russia, which, whether intentionally or not, were bound eventually to provoke a war. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, and as I've made clear already in earlier programs, I think these actions were intentional, and I think they will have consequences every bit as catastrophic for the international system, for the people of Ukraine, and for the geopolitical position of the West, as all those other wars, including the war in Iraq, have done. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. I think it would take much too long for me to discuss the Iraq war in more detail. It might be something that we might discuss perhaps on the Duran in a program, Alex and I, but I think perhaps it's something which, given how much news is going on, we might want to remember, but perhaps focus our own efforts on covering the effects, the consequences of the policies, the same set of policies, as I said, which led to the Iraq war, cover the consequences of those policies as they're being acted out now. With that, let me now return to the main topic of this program, which, as is nearly always the case now, is the war in Ukraine. And over the last few hours, there's been a cascade of information from the battlefields, and most specifically from the situation in and around Bakhmut. And I'm going to take this from Boris Rozhin, who is a Russian commentator, based in Sevastopol, by the way. He writes under the name of Colonel Kassad, but he's been widely acknowledged as being one of the best and most reliable military commentators on the Russian side. He is very strong ideological and patriotic biases. He's very much somebody who supports the war, who has been strongly opposed to the Ukrainian government, and he's also someone of very strong communist views, by the way. But none of this, in my opinion, detracts in any way from the fact that he's both an insightful commentator of military developments and also an accurate commentator and reporter of what is happening. In fact, he clearly has a great deal of information directly from the battlefronts. He must have a network of people who keep him informed, because I have to say this, in fact, in truth and in frankness, I can't recall a single instance when he's reported something which turned out to be wrong. I'm not saying he hasn't. All I'm saying is I can't recall such an instance. Anyway, this is what he tells us about the situation in Bakhmut. And Bakhmut, of course, remains very much, for the moment, the epicenter of the fighting in Ukraine. And he provides this information as of 11 p.m. Moscow time on March the 18th. He says that fighting continues in the area of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka, Khromovo and Bogdanovka. The settlements have not yet been taken. Now, to remind everyone, Orekhovo-Vasilyevka is a village well to the northwest of Bakhmut. It's been targeted by the Russians, first and foremost by the Wagner organization assault troops. I've discussed in recent programs its importance. If Orekhovo-Vasilyevka is indeed captured by the Russians, and there were reports about a day ago that the Russians have taken this village in a pincer and are actually close to its capture. If Orekhovo-Vasilyevka is captured, the Russians will be in control of the high ground. They'll be able to shell the advanced positions of the Ukrainian military with respect to the defenses of the much bigger city of Kramatorsk, further west, and they will also be able, apparently, to shell Ukrainian communications moving towards Bakhmut itself. The fall of Orekhovo-Vasilyevka would make it extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to maintain their positions close to Bakhmut, because basically the Russians would be controlling the high ground. So obviously this is a village which Ukraine must defend, and the reports are that it is desperately attempting to do so. But fighting is going on there, and that's what Boris Rogin confirms. Now, Khromovo is an entirely different village. It's a village significantly further south. It's the village that lies astride the road from Chasov Yar, the northern road from Chasov Yar to Bakhmut. There were reports a few days ago, which I believe are correct, that the Ukrainians themselves have pulled out of this village, but the Russians have not yet been able to occupy it because the Ukrainians are able to shell any Russian troops that do enter that village, and until the Ukrainian artillery fire has been fully suppressed, it seems that the Khromovo doesn't provide sufficient cover, and the Russians are therefore reluctant to enter the place. That does not change the fact that the road that passes through Khromovo is to all intents and purposes unusable by Ukraine. And Bogdanovka is a rather bigger place, as I understand it, but it's located somewhere between Orekhovo-Vasilyevka and Khromovo, and it's also being defended by the Ukrainians. If it's captured by the Russians, they will be able to simplify, straighten out their front lines in this area, and that might be important in connection with the Ukrainian counterattack that many people are predicting. And Boris Rogin's next comment is specifically about the prospects of that counterattack. He says that there is an accumulation of enemy forces in the area of Konstantinovka, Rai Alexandrovka, and Chasov Yar. It is possible to activate enemy counterattacks in order to stabilize the situation. I don't fully understand the second sentence. This is, I suspect, in part a machine translation, though I'm reading it from an English language site. But anyway, there's been a lot of discussion recently about this build-up of Ukrainian forces. Now, Konstantinovka is some distance in the rear. It's a small town. It's bigger than a village, and I don't know much about Rai Alexandrovka, but of course Chasov Yar is apparently a very small place, very close to Bakhmut, and I'm assuming that this Ukrainian build-up is in this specific area. Now, Boris Rogin, as I said, is floating the possibility of a Ukrainian counterattack. And I've heard it suggested, for example, in the military summary channel, that Ukraine will launch this counterattack next week, perhaps on Thursday. We will have to see whether that is the case, and note that we don't yet know. Boris Rogin doesn't tell us the exact number of Ukrainian troops in this area. I would say that if this is where the major concentration of Ukrainian troops is located, then it seems to me that the major point of attack of the Ukrainian forces would more probably be the southern pincer, the one that's reached Ivaniivka, and which has basically cut the southern spur of the road from Chasov Yar, rather than the northern positions around places in conjunction with places like Orekhovo, Vasilievka, Khromovo, Bogdanovka, that I've just been talking about previously. But as I've said many times, I'm not a military person. I'm not able to discuss tactics and strategy in the kind of way that military people can. And I will just have to wait and see what comes there. I'm going to also add that it does seem to me that, putting aside the possibility of a Ukrainian counterattack, which I think much more likely than not, by the way, this concentration of Ukrainian troops in this particular area, Konstantinovka, Raya Alexandrovka and Chasov Yar, would also be the place where I personally, looking at maps, would expect the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces, in case Bakhmut were to fall, and that they might concentrate their forces there more with the view to setting up a second defense line than perhaps to try to relieve the attack, the siege of Bakhmut, the ongoing siege of Bakhmut that is taking place. But again, I want to stress, I am not an expert on this. This is way beyond my actual knowledge. All I can say is this is where the Ukrainian troops are apparently concentrating. Most people seem to think, and I personally think, that they will launch some kind of a counterattack to break the siege, but possibly, just possibly, what they're doing instead is preparing another defense line. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then Boris Rogin goes on to say, in the center of the city, the fighting is moving towards the Artyomovsk, he says Artyomovsk, let's call it the Bakhmut administration building, which is just over half a kilometer away. In other words, it is within 500 meters now of the Russian troops in Bakhmut. And one perhaps shouldn't make too much about the fact that the Russians might soon capture the administrative building of a town. Doesn't mean that the whole town has been cleared by any means, but I suppose it does have some kind of symbolic significance. Boris Rogin also goes on to say that fighting is also breaking out near the stadium, and this is a large structure well to the south, and again, if it is captured, and if the administration building is captured, and if the giant Azom plant is also fully captured, then we are, I think, definitely looking at a situation where the Russians are in virtual control of Bakhmut. There might be a few places where Ukrainian troops are still holding out, But overall, one would be justified at that point in saying that Bakhmut has fallen. And in fact, Boris Rogin goes on to say that most of the industrial zone of the Azov plant has been cleared by assault teams, by he means Russian assault teams. In the coming days, the entire plant will be completely released. So we can see that the Ukrainian defense in the Azov plant, according to Boris Rogin, has crumbled, and that the Azov plant is now largely under Russian control and perhaps may soon be in its entirety. He then goes on to say to the south of the city, fighting continues in what he calls the Krasnoye area. This is this village of Ivanivska, which, as I've said previously, lies literally on top of the southern spur of the road from Chasov Yar. Okhromovo is on the northern spur, Ivanivska is on the southern spur, but the road in both cases is unusable. But the Russians have been trying to capture this particular place. Again, Boris Rogin calls it Krasnoya because this is the Russian name for this particular village. Krasny means red, so you can understand perhaps why the Ukrainians don't like that particular name, since it has something of the Soviet Union about it. But anyway, a sense of the importance that Ukraine attaches to control of Ivanivska could be provided by a further report I've seen that there are actually three Ukrainian brigades operating in this rather small place, more big village than a small town, trying to hold the village and to prevent its capture by the Russians, and to prevent the Russians actually cutting the road. Now, I don't know for a fact that there are indeed three brigades there, but perhaps there are. And, of course, it's most unlikely that these three brigades are anywhere close to being up to strength. Three brigades would be between, 12 and 16,000 men, but I suspect we're talking about a much smaller force than that. But since we are talking about three brigades, and going back to what I was saying about that, the fact that Ukrainian troops, possibly for a counterattack, perhaps just possibly to defend, to create a new defense line, seem to be concentrating in Konstantinovka, Raya Alexandrovka and Chasov Yar being very close to Ivanivska. Just possibly the fact that Ukraine has held on to this village and fought so hard to hold on to this village and has a total of three brigades there. That might also point to a Ukrainian plan to attack, to launch its counterattack through this village. Just saying. And then Boris Rogin's last point, in the south of Artyomovsk, as he calls it, fighting, Bakhmut in other words, fighting continues near the destroyed monument to the pilots, where the famous MiG-17 statue was. So that's all from Boris Rogin, and it gives a fairly clear picture of what's going on, it seems to me, in the Battle of Bakhmut. It does look as if the Russians are coming very close now to a position where they dominate and can be said to have captured the whole town of Bakhmut. But rumors of this Ukrainian counterattack continue, and as I suggested, the most likely point of attack for this Ukrainian counterattack, if it does come, is in the direction of the southern spur of the Russian troops, the Wagner assault troops, which has basically reached Ivanivska. So we'll see whether there is a Ukrainian counterattack next week. As I said in my previous program, I think that this will be the last week in which such a counterattack is practical. I think beyond that, it's becoming increasingly unlikely that the whole of Bakhmut can be held. I think that if the if Ukraine delays its counterattack beyond next week, then realistically, Bakhmut is lost, and I suspect that by that point, the whole situation will be irretrievable. Now, I would say that there's been some reports also, this is from a completely different source, the same source that reported, however, that Ukraine had positioned 3 brigades in Ivanivska. There's a further report, however, that the Russians are starting to drive north along the western edge of Ivanivska. They're driving north towards Khromovo, and that might imply, I just want to stress again, it might imply some kind of a plan to close the 2 pincers, which would, of course, bring the entire Ukrainian defense position within Bakhmut into complete crisis. But anyway, that's where we are at the present time. Now, there's lots of fighting in all kinds of other places. There's been more fighting apparently around Avdiivka, and as I said previously, the Russians seem to be working to try to encircle Avdiivka, and there's also some information that the Russian forces in Vuhledar have continued to make progress towards the encirclement of Vuhledar itself, even as other Russian troops are gradually clearing the last Ukrainian defenders from Marinka, which, if true, if we are seeing Marinka about to fall and perhaps Vuhledar coming under pressure, it could also mean a Ukrainian collapse in Vuhledar, which would ultimately mean, or so it seems to me, a collapse in Ukrainian positions in southern Donbass. Now, that's all I think I can say at the moment. There's lots more information pouring in from all kinds of different sources, most of which suggest continued Russian advances in Bakhmut, going beyond those reported by Boris Rozhin. All I'm going to say about them is this: Boris Rozhin has been a consistently reliable commentator. It may be that the situation for the Ukrainians is even worse than Boris Rozhin says, but for the moment, I'm going to stick with him. So that's, as far as I can say, the situation in Bakhmut, and it's also the main situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, the Russians launched a major drone attack across Ukraine with uranium-2 drones. There's been relatively little information about this drone attack up to now, but dribbles of information are beginning to come through that suggest that it was devastating in its effect, and that relatively few of these relatively slow, largish drones were shot down, which suggests that something is wrong with the Ukrainian air defense system. Now, I say that because These drones are relatively easy to shoot down. I'm not saying that the Ukrainians have ever managed to shoot down all of them. Some of them have always, it seems to me, managed to get through. But anyway, on this occasion, they did break through and they did cause a great deal of damage. And there's some reports that a particular drone, one of these drones, crashed into a restaurant in Dnipro, this is the Ukrainian town of Dnipro, and large numbers of foreign fighters. The Russians called them mercenaries. The Western powers and Ukraine called them volunteers. For the record, I think they're better understood as mercenaries, but never mind. But anyway, that a large number of these foreign fighters were caught in this restaurant and killed. And this does seem to be a reasonably reliable report. Now, the question is, why is there less shooting down of drones than there had been previously? Well, there are various possible explanations. The obvious one, is that Ukraine is out of missiles. We've been hearing reports now for several weeks about how the Ukrainian air defense system has become severely depleted, and it could be that it's now depleted to the point where Ukraine feels that it can't just launch missiles to shoot down drones, however damaging, how much damage these drones do. Second possibility is that, yes, the Ukrainian air defense system is indeed depleted, but Ukraine has nonetheless made a tactical decision that it's no longer going to launch its missiles against drones, because doing so is not cost effective and makes no tactical sense. And the third possibility is simply that the Ukrainians have decided to hold back their air defense missiles, because they expect that they're going to need them much more in the coming weeks, either to support their own big counteroffensive when it comes, or perhaps to repel whatever offensive the Russians launch. I don't know what the truth amongst these possibilities is, but it does seem that Ukrainian air defenses were badly disarrayed by the last big Russian cruise missile strike, and that cruise missile strike, which, as I said previously, included 6 Kinzhal missiles, may have caused the Ukrainians either to rethink their tactics and to conserve their missiles, or perhaps it's finally drained them dry. Again, I don't know what it is. We'll wait and see. No doubt more will become clear in due course. Now, all of this now brings me to what I think is perhaps the single most important aspect of this war, which is logistics. And not just logistics, but also equipment and manpower levels. And all the indications are of a very big Russian build-up continuing. And we've also seen reports of various new Russian equipment being deployed on the scene of the battle. Now, about a week ago, I reported how Boomerang wheeled infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, these are absolutely state-of-the-art machines, were apparently being deployed by Russia on the battlefields. Now, about a day ago, photographs appeared, a picture appeared, actually a short video appeared of Russian paratroopers operating a light vehicle called well, it's one of the Typhoon family. It's a special vehicle used for reconnaissance. Apparently, it's also a new vehicle, not previously deployed, not just in this particular war, but even with the Russian armed forces. And the Russian military has just provided information about training of Russian troops with the new T-90M tanks. And they've actually provided a video, and it reads, this is from the Russian Ministry of Defense. During the training, the T-90M Proryev tank crews study the weakest and most vulnerable places of the latest Western-made tanks supplied to the needs of the armed forces of Ukraine by NATO countries, and also hone their skills in fire training and control of the combat vehicle. Tank crews are trained in an impromptu class at one of the ranges in the rear area of the special military operation. Instructors teach tankmen the tactics and specifics of combat against enemy tanks. Moreover, gunners and tank commanders are trained to give target designations and engage targets at a distance of up to 4 kilometers. Drivers hone their skills in overcoming terrain obstacles. The tank crews will begin their missions in the area of the special military operation once combat cohesion is completed. Now, this is an interesting report from the Russian Defense Ministry, because it suggests a number of things. Firstly, contrary to some claims, which I've seen, for example, in the British media, repeated also in places like Wikipedia, Russia has not so far deployed T-90M Proryev tanks to the area of the special military operation. Now, there have been reports that the Ukrainians have captured some of these tanks, but I've been a little skeptical of these claims, and this particular report from the Russian Ministry of Defense strongly suggests that Russian tank crews are still training to use these machines, and that they haven't yet been deployed on the battlefronts. The second point to make is that these tank crews with these T-90M tanks are apparently being trained to fight Western tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, perhaps eventually Abrams tanks, if they do ever appear on the scene. And as I previously pointed out, it seems that current production of new tanks by the Ural Vagon Zavod factory at least matches and probably greatly exceeds the number of tanks that are being supplied to Ukraine by the Western powers, and moreover, new tanks that Ural Vagon Zavod is making will almost certainly be principally, in fact exclusively, T-90Ms. Any other tank, new tank made by Ural Vagon Zavod will be the enigmatic Armata tank, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. So there was a report some weeks ago that Russian tank production, this is new tank production, I'm not talking about refurbished tanks, Ural Vagon Zavod and other Russian factories are busy refurbishing old tanks and bringing them up to modern specifications in very large numbers. But Ural Vagon Zavod allegedly was making 20 tanks a month. I suspect it is more than that, but 20 tanks a month would mean 240 tanks over the course of a year. Allegedly, around 200 T-90Ms were supplied to the Russian military in the area of the special military operation towards the end of last year. I suspect that more batches have been supplied since then. I suspect that eventually, by the time the Ukrainians are in a position to launch their offensive, whenever that is, perhaps in May, there will be at least as many T-90M tanks on the battlefronts as there are Western tanks, and that these T-90M tanks are actually more modern. They're a more modern tank than any of the tanks, the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s, that have been supplied by the West to Ukraine up to now. Just saying. The third point I would make, and it comes directly to the point that Brian Beletic has been making, that the Russians are making it very clear that the tank crews are still in training and that they will only be deployed to the battlefronts once they have achieved combat cohesion. In other words, once they're able to function as a team. In other words, all the various military units that use these tanks know how to use them properly in combined arms warfare, and once the tank crews themselves have perfected their understanding of how to operate these tanks. Now, probably, again, the training period is going to be less than it might be in peacetime, but I suspect the training of on the T-90M may have started some months ago anyway, and I suspect that the Russian tankers will be better trained in operating this tank, which is itself a progressive evolution of the T-72, with which they will already be familiar with. They will probably have a better understanding of this tank and a better feel for how it operates than the Ukrainians will have with their Western tanks when they appear on the scene. Anyway, I might be wrong about all of those points, but that's what I think, and I did find this an interesting report from the Russian Defense Ministry. Whilst I'm on the topic of the Russian Defense Ministry, Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, recently the subject of an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, which I discussed extensively in my program yesterday. Anyway, he's been on a tour of some of these areas. He held a video conference, I believe this was done from Moscow, with various top officials discussing the economic and social needs of Crimea and some of the other regions that the Russians now claim as part of their own territory and which they have taken control over the course of this special military operation. He then turned up in Sevastopol itself, driving his own car. It's kind of, I'm going to say, it's stunt that Putin does like to pull from time to time. It does perhaps give an impression of a dynamic leader who's not also someone who's chauffeured around everywhere, closer, if you like, to the lives of most people than other leaders might be. Anyway, I don't know how impressed people actually are by these things, but anyway, for what it's worth, that's what he did. Anyway, he was in Crimea. He visited Sevastopol. He met with various people. He was, of course, commemorating the anniversary, the 9th anniversary of the Crimean referendum and of Crimea's unification with Russia. He also took interest in the excavations that are the archaeological excavations that are taking place in Crimea. This is a major archaeological area, by the way, and he was talking about the setting up of an archaeological park there, And for the record, the ancient Greek city of Kherson and the Byzantine city of Kherson are located in Crimea. They have no connection physically with the present city of Kherson on the right bank of the Dnieper. When Catherine the Great and Prince Potyomkin gave names, sometimes drawn from classical antiquity, to various towns that they founded in this part of the world, they got the location of Kherson wrong. They assumed it was on the Dnieper, when it was in fact always and had always been in Crimea itself. Anyway, just saying, just a little piece of topographical curiosity, if you like. Anyway, Putin was there, and then we're also told that he went somewhere, we're not told exactly where, and he visited the headquarters, the military headquarters of the command, of the Russian command, which is conducting the war. And the Kremlin website provides us with the most brief explanation of what Putin did there. I'll just read it. Vladimir Putin had a meeting at the command post of the special military operation. And it is, in fact, we learn in Rostov-on-Don, which is, in fact, and part of Russia, which is already part of Russia before the special military operation began. And it goes on to say that the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Armed Forces, which is to say Putin himself, heard reports by the Chief of the General Staff of Russia's Armed Forces, First Deputy Minister of Defense Valery Gerasimov, and a number of commanders. And that's all we're told. That's the full account of this. And I've not, by the way, been provided by a photo. There's not a photographic study, so we don't know which commanders were there, though I'm confident that Surovikin was. And of course, we're not told what was discussed, and the Russians, unlike the Ukrainians, are very careful to keep their secrets to themselves. Anyway, that's the situation so far on the battlefronts. There's been a whole succession of really rather troubled articles in the Western media about the pending Chinese-Russian summit meeting in Moscow, about Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow. And I have to say, some of the reporting, to my mind, borders on not just alarmist, but even beyond alarmist, actually. There was one article that spoke, is by Brendan Sims in the Daily Telegraph. Russia and China's new alliance is beginning to echo December 1941. This seems to me, as I said, an extraordinary statement. What on earth does that mean? December 1941 was, of course, the month of Pearl Harbor. I think if you actually go on to read the article, you get the impression that this was the month when Germany and Japan both decided to attack the United States. Japan launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Germany declared war on the United States. And the implication is that Russia and China are preparing to do something similar. I think that is a crazy analogy myself. I think it's nothing to do with reality. I don't think that the Russians and the Chinese have any remotely similar plans. As I've said already, I think they're coming together, no doubt, because it is in their interests too. I think if there had been no pressure at all from the West, the Chinese and the Russians would still be working together on many things. They would still be converging in many ways. Why, after all, would they not? But undoubtedly, what has accelerated their combining forces is the fact that they feel themselves to be under pressure from the United States and from the Western powers. And I discussed at the start of this program how the Ukraine war, in my opinion, fits into that sequence of wars which the neocons began on various geopolitical rationales, going all the way back to the 1990s, and which the Russians and the Chinese have now come to feel are ultimately directed at themselves. And that's why they are, as I said, coming together in the way that they are. The other thing I have to say that this writer, that this article seems to get wrong, and which I found most bizarre, is that this writer, Brendan Sims, seems oblivious about one fundamental difference between the world of 1941 and the world of today, which is that in December 1941, the United States was far and away the strongest industrial power in the world. It dwarfed production in Europe. It was perhaps already potentially not just the biggest industrial power of that time, but perhaps it already accounted, certainly did by the end of the war, the Second World War, it accounted for more than half of total industrial output by all humanity. That was the position of the United States in the 1940s. Well, that is certainly not the case today. Today, China by itself has a bigger industrial base than the United States and the European Union combined, and of course joined to Russia with its own significant, though much smaller, industrial base, and with its immense numbers of enormous natural resources. Well, it becomes no contest. The situation, in effect, is the reverse of what it was in December 1941. And helpfully, there is an article in the Financial Times today which all but says as much. Now, over multiple programs extending all the way back to the start of the war, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has been explaining the importance of industrial warfare, the importance of providing munitions and weapons to sustain a war, about the fact that the West is incapable of doing that to any extent, and that this is why ultimately, in the end, Ukraine is going to lose, because as Ukraine cannot match Russian industrial power by itself, as Ukraine doesn't have the manpower resources that Russia has, its only prospect of success would have been if the West had been able to come to its help, and the fact that Western industrial prowess is now so limited that the West cannot do that means that ultimately Ukraine cannot win this war. And Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vashinin has been saying the same, and of course I've been saying it too, and so have many others. Well, over the last few weeks there's been lots of talk about trying to increase ammunition production, and it is shells, the lack of shells, which are the decisive weapon, the decisive problem in this war, because the Russians have chosen to fight this war, as an artillery war, knowing the enormous preponderance of artillery that they possess, knowing that they possess enormous industrial capacities to increase shell production. The volumes of shells that they produce are already much greater than those of the Western powers. Before the war, their stockpiles dwarfed those of the Western powers, and the Russians have basically fought this war as a war of attrition, knowing that that way they can grind down the Ukrainians, deplete Western arsenals, deplete Ukrainian weapon stocks, and achieve victory at minimum cost to themselves. And over the last few weeks, there have been lots of reports about the frantic efforts in both the United States and in Europe to increase supplies of ammunition to Ukraine. And a few weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign minister, that's what he effectively is, actually came forward and said that unless the ammunition supplies to Ukraine are increased, the war is over. And he didn't quite explain what he meant by that, but the clear implication was that Ukraine would lose the war. Well, we've seen over the last couple of weeks that the United States is having trouble increasing its own supplies, its own production of ammunition. Apparently, after massive effort, it's succeeded in increasing ammunition production, 155 millimeter production, from 15,000 shells a month to around 20,000. 20,000 shells a month is the number of shells Russia fires on an average day in the fighting in Ukraine. It's perhaps 5 days worth of shells for the Ukrainian military, on the assumption that Ukrainian expenditure of shells has fallen to 3,000 a day from the 5,000 it was a few weeks ago. So the US is struggling, and the reports are that it might take the United States up to 5 years to bring production of shells up to 90,000 a month, which would still be significantly less than what the Russians are using every month in Ukraine. And bear in mind, the United States needs a large proportion of those shells to rebuild its own stocks. Anyway, we now have, from the Financial Times, a discussion of what the situation is like in Europe, and it is worse. Now, can I just say, about a couple of days ago, the German government announced its latest package of weapons for Ukraine, and it included just 5,000 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition. 5,000 rounds, just a day and a half's worth of what Ukraine is currently expending. But the problems go much deeper. Now, the EU has been busy trying to centralize production of shells. There's been talk about devoting billions of euros to increasing production of shells. I've said that I in the past have had some experience of of industrial matters, and I've said that simply throwing money at a problem doesn't solve the problem. That money has to be put to use. You have to increase the factory space, find the materials, train the workers. However much money you throw at a problem, these are physical limits you simply can't get round. It takes time to build up production in this way, however many billions you throw at a problem. And this is what the Financial Times has now telling us. And it reads as follows. Now, this article is behind a paywall. I'm going to, as I said, be careful. I'm not going to read it all, but I'm going to get through what I think are the most important points. Explosives shortage threatens EU drive to arm Ukraine. And in fact, as we're going to find out in a moment, it's not just explosives. And first paragraph, Europe's push to make arms for Ukraine has been hobbled by a shortage of explosives, which industry insiders feel will delay efforts to boost shell production by as much as 3 years. 3 years. Ukraine is supposed to launch this spring offensive this month. It's in a few months, perhaps in May. It's critically short of ammunition. You see Ukrainian soldiers complaining about this. It's going to have to wait 3 years before the EU is in a position to produce shells in the quantity that it needs. Scarce supplies of gunpowder, plastic explosives and TNT have left industry unable to rapidly meet expected EU orders for Ukraine, regardless of how much money is thrown at the problem, according to officials and producers. And then we go on to read that the fundamental problem is that the European defence industry is not in good shape for large-scale war production. This is what Beletic and Bashinin have been saying for months. And, of course, there's also the problem that you have to restock national armories which have already been depleted. And then there's the warning. Producers, industry executives and EU officials warn increased demand may only push up prices that have jumped a fifth over the past year. It's Economics 101. If you think you are solving a problem by throwing money at it and ignore the physical constraints, then that money is simply going to find its way into higher prices. And that's exactly what's happened. And then we go on to read it. This is from J. Hinek, chair of the Defence and Security Industry Association of the Czech Republic. It's very difficult to increase production of artillery ammunition, especially the heavy, large caliber ammunition, in a short time. A new artillery factory is very easy, but how to produce more artillery projectiles without raw materials? And then we go to hear that there are bottlenecks with gunpowder, TNT, nitrocellulose, and it's not possible, this is from Hinek again, to increase in a short time nitrocellulose production. In Europe, there are no important producers of the raw materials we need. If I want to increase production of gunpowder, I need probably 3 years. And then we learn that Explosia, Czech state-owned manufacturer that is one of Europe's largest suppliers of explosives, has told the FT that its production of propellants used in 155mm artillery is running at full capacity and cannot be increased until 2026. Investments are underway to further increase our production capacity, but this is a 3-year project, not a few months' job. And then we were told that, we're going on to read, that Romania's government has said that it's in talks with the United States and South Korea to build a new gunpowder factory in the country. But its last one was shut down in 2004. There was, by the way, talk a few months ago, I remember it, of Romania reopening a factory to build 152 millimeter shells. That's Soviet caliber shells, such as were used by Ukrainian artillery at the start of the war. But that project has obviously been hobbled because there's no explosives. And then we also go on to read that this is from Spain. Fabrica Municiones de Granada, one of Spain's two 155 millimeter artillery producers, has been operating at full capacity since October. But Antonio Caro said, its Director General, said it had taken 4 to 5 months to scale up because of the difficulty of obtaining basic materials and components. And our main problem is primary materials. Supplies for ammunition are very strained around the world because all the factories, like us, are at 100% capacity. There aren't too many factories producing materials like TNT and nitrocellulose in Europe, and they're at 100% too. So we have to start looking in India, in Korea, in other countries far away. And then we go on to read that the cost of basic materials has doubled and in some cases tripled, Caro said. Those increases and the surge in demand has led to higher prices for munitions, although the rise has been less pronounced. A typical shell today costs €850, roughly 20% more than before the Russian invasion. And then we read that FMG, that's the Spanish factory, like the Slovak group MSM, has no plans to increase capacity further. Hopefully the war will be over soon, Caro said. So Europe cannot make the shells, at least not in the time frame that Ukraine needs. Now, there's been some talk of the Europeans providing Ukraine this year with 1 million shells. Nowhere near enough in itself to solve Ukraine's problems if the fighting is to persist over the entire year. But of course, doing that will leave Europe wholly out of shells. Doesn't seem to me like a good idea. And frankly, I doubt that the militaries in the various European states will permit that to happen. They will insist that at least they retain a proportion of the existing stockpiles. So, no shells for Ukraine, no shells for Europe. Which is it going to be? If it is no shells for Ukraine, then Ukraine cannot win the war. If it is no shells for Europe, then Ukraine might stagger on for a few more months, but then the problem we already face is going to repeat itself. Surely the point has now been reached when even European leaders, who seem to have this blindness to realities, to actual physical realities, understand that capacities have now been exhausted, realities are now starting to intrude, and that the point has come to set aside poses like arrest warrants, which cannot be enforced and of no practical reality, and to tell Ukraine and Moscow that the game is over and it's time to agree peace. Xi Jinping is going to be in Moscow on Monday. He's proposed various ways forward to achieve peace. Perhaps if the European leaders aren't able to talk to Putin, maybe they should talk to him. He will, of course, talk to Putin, and the decision as to what peace there would then be would be decided by the Chinese and the Russians. with the Russians holding all the strong cards. Well, that's where I end this video today. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under the video. And also don't forget to check out our shop. If you want, in addition to support our work, to support this channel, please remember to check your subscription. And if you've liked this video, please tick the like button. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.